there's a bit of a looming crisis for the US in terms of how it maintains its own nuclear submarine fleet and the sort of numbers that it's got at the moment of around 60, I think.
So, firstly, on the sort of crewing of platforms, I used to beat up the Air Force on the basis that if you looked at a destroyer in the First World War in the Navy, a destroyer in the Second World War, a destroyer in the Gulf War, and a destroyer now, you can see a reduction in the crew from sort of 700 or 800 down to just over 200
Mm.
today. If you looked at a tank at the Battle of Cambrai in the First World War, there was a crew of 6 or 7 down to a crew of 3 or 4
8.
today. If you look at the first ever fighter jet to the latest, it's 1 1 1 1 1 1 1. Now, I would use that as an example of why the Air Force was failing to innovate. They would say that they've always been at the irreducible minimum. But I think what's very interesting is such is the sophistication of the electronic warfare battle now that we're seeing all of these uncrewed systems are no longer truly autonomous. They're flying with these fiber optic spools so that they become wire guided. And so I've heard people speak really compellingly now about how if EW is going to be so all pervasive, you can't just have the human in the loop 5,000 miles to the rear because the human will be cut out of the loop by EW. So your solution is one of two things: either a completely autonomous AI driven fighting force that is prosecuting the enemy entirely on its own decision making with no human in the loop, or you still need to get a human forward, be that on a command ship or a command jet or the one tank in the battle space with the hundreds of drones all operating around it. But that's how you maintain an element of human decision making in the modern battle space. I wonder where you stand on that, because I think the guiding light for now, discuss whether it changes in the second week of the war when the war comes. But Western governments are very much of the view that a human must always remain in the loop somehow, and that kill decisions remain in humankind's hands rather than the hands of an algorithm.
Yeah, and I think that makes eminent sense, doesn't it? If you imagine that situation, which does occur from time to time, of an airliner coming towards London that doesn't respond to air traffic control and all the different squawks and signals that are being sent towards it, and a fighter jet is sent up to have a look and see if it's been hijacked, or are we looking at a 9/11 situation? I think all of us, if we were on that plane, would prefer a human to be in the cockpit of that fighter jet, particularly because we know that some types of AI that are being used now, like the large language models, which is different, obviously, to an autonomous aircraft, but we know that they're developing these increasingly large rates of hallucinations, so-called, basically making things up, and that the developers can't quite explain why it is that this is happening. Now, some are suggesting that they are simply learning to ape human behavior, which is sometimes a talent for BS, as it were, and therefore they're trying to sort of blag their way through certain situations. Literally AI giving cheeky answers to people saying, are you making things up, and all that sort of thing. Now, coming back to autonomy in weaponry, I think you're right. I mean, the point you're making about electronic warfare is absolutely right. So then you end up with literally a wire. People used to make jokes about electric cars and would the flex be long enough to keep it plugged in? Well, some of these drones being used on the front line have spools 20, 25 kilometers long of fiber optics that deploy as they fly. But this is all to do with the issue of jamming. And ultimately, I think autonomy is a more efficient answer to that. It's one thing with a
But
weapon.
inherent to that is the complete removal of the human from the kill loop.
Well, not to no. Well, the fiber optic is, of course, a way of a person remaining in control. But yes, of course, inherent to just turning it over to completely autonomous operation. Yeah, you're absolutely right. And personally, I would be I would take exactly the same view as you, and and I mentioned the sort of 9/11 sort of scenario, but once again, for those people who don't find the idea of us going to war against Russia particularly credible, and we think more about things that have actually happened in the recent past, those sorts of operation where special forces might be entering a house where hostages are, or where there's a mixture of innocents and terrorists, once again, you think, well, I'm going to put my money on the judgment of that SAS operator as they go through the door, rather than on some robotic device that goes in, with heat sensors and other things, seeking out people in order to eliminate them. So yes, I think we're certainly still at a stage, and even if you get to a point where you have these drone swarms and fleets of they call them uncrewed ground vehicles, UGVs, but effectively they are tanks or other armored vehicles without crews, moving across the battlefield. I mean, you get down to the really prosaic stuff of, who's going to change the batteries, and who's going to make the necessary adjustments of battle damage and all the rest of it when they come back from a mission. Human beings are definitely going to be there on the battlefield, I would say, for the foreseeable future, even if their role is, for example, once these swarms of drones have come in and swept some ridge clear or something like that in the Ukrainian context, that the humans will have to go forward in order to hold that and establish it as a new forward base for these robotic or uncrewed systems. So people will still be moving about on the battlefield. They'll still be part of it. Which means that many of the things that we recognize as part of the armory of a modern state, whether that's a heavily armored vehicle or whether it's a helicopter carrying soldiers forward, they'll all still be part of the picture, I think, for some years to come. You can't turn the whole thing over to robotics because, I mean, once they get sufficiently developed technically in a robotic sense and smart enough in an AI sense to plug themselves in, repair their own damage and all the rest of it, then you really are beginning to look towards potentially existential threats from a human perspective.
Quite. Mark, the other thing I wanted to pick up on your excellent essay on the sort of changing nature of military inventories was you spoke about the renewal of the UK nuclear deterrent. Now, for those who are watching this who don't necessarily understand how that works, the UK operates a sovereign nuclear deterrent in so much as it is entirely the business of the United Kingdom government how it chooses to deploy nuclear weapons. But the UK nuclear enterprise is very closely intertwined with the US. We use the Trident missile delivery system, which is a US system, and there's lots of other technology sharing around propulsion, for example. Now, that propulsion exchange of technology was broadened to include the Australians only 3 or 4 years ago, to great fanfare. And there's lots of alarm within UK and Australian military circles this week because Bridge Colby, who most people credit as being the brains in the US DoD, has said that he is not convinced that Aukus, that propulsion exchange, is any longer in the US interest. Mark, what's your take on that? Is this saber rattling, or are we about to see Aukus unravel?
Well, part of the deal, as you know very well, but just so that people listening in understand, is that as Australia builds up towards deploying new submarines in the 2040s, that it puts people on board UK and US submarines to train them in the necessary skills, but then acquires its own small fleet of nuclear-powered submarines in the not too distant future. I think dates have been given like the early 2030s. Now, the idea of this, when this agreement was made, was that the Americans would pass on between 3 and 5 nuclear submarines, so that wholly Australian crews or Australian mentored crews could start working on these and really get all the skills and training up to scratch, and of course the operational savvy of how to use these boats. Now, the problem I think for the US is if you look at their attack submarine, nuclear powered submarine fleet, they require a build rate of around 2 a year. And in order to maintain that with the number of slipways and yards they've got that can build nuclear submarines, they can't really take more than 5 years to build each submarine. And they're currently taking 6 years. So there's a bit of a looming crisis for the US in terms of how it maintains its own nuclear submarine fleet and the sort of numbers that it's got at the moment of around 60, I think it is. So I can well imagine that if I was the chief of naval operations sitting in the Pentagon running the US Navy, I would be rather nervous about a commitment to lend Australia 3 new submarines at a point in the not too distant future. And that's why Bridge Colby is reassessing this whole thing. And I think that given the, America first nature of the Trump administration and its whole political philosophy, I think you're right to be worried, and people who are worried are right to be worried, that if it looks like a significant impact on the US submarine fleet, they may well seek to get out of this commitment, particularly this element of it, which is offering them to the Australians in a few years' time. And that's, I think, where the real nub of this comes. Now, apparently, some people have been commenting this morning that this, we see things as being quite difficult, for example, with the F-35 for contractual reasons, all the supply chain and other reasons. And apparently, you've got the added complexity here that this is governed by a treaty between the nations concerned. So it's not just a contractual commitment, but it's a treaty commitment that the UK, US, and Australia have entered into to do this together. Now, I guess the treaty could become a dead letter if effectively the US stops cooperating, but it does mean they're obliged by the treaty to sort of carry on in good faith. So I think we could find it could be quite hard for the Americans to just from one day to the next say, well, we're not going to do this. And I suspect that what they'll be scratching their heads over in the Pentagon is whether there are alternative ways of trying to reach the same objective. Because I think all of them get it, that having several more nuclear-powered submarines available with all the capabilities they've got of remaining underwater for months, high turns of speed compared with the diesel-electric ones, all of those other things, would be a very good thing to have the extra ones that the Royal Australian Navy would operate in terms of the strategic balance with China. And that in that sense, the objective is still one that I suspect the US Navy and clearly the UK would very much support. The question is, how do you achieve it when the difficulties of increasing production of nuclear submarines are such that it may be profoundly problematic to do it?